Before we get into Alice Asylum, I'm going to go briefly over events that occurred in previous entries, so those who aren't familiar with the Alice games have a better understanding of the series so far. The series begins with American McGee's Alice, a game that is based somewhat on the classic stories of Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, both novels by Charles Dodgson, under the pen name of Lewis Carroll. The idea of the game is to be a what-if scenario. What would it be like if Alice returned to Wonderland many years later on in her life? At the start of the first game, the intro shows us that Alice is asleep, having a dream about Wonderland. She awakes to a house fire. Alice's family are unfortunately killed, but she manages to escape, albeit badly burned and with a lot of mental trauma. We time skip some several years to her being in bed in an asylum called Rutledge. She has been in a state of catatonia ever since she arrived. In her arm we see a stuffed toy rabbit, and it seemingly comes to life and screams. Save us, Alice! Alice seems to respond to this and looks at the stuffed toy in shock. Due to her condition, I assume this is somewhat happening in her mind rather than in reality. Next we see her falling and screaming down some kind of pool, sending her into Wonderland, which again I assume is happening inside her mind, and she is probably physically still laying in her bed. And off she goes on another adventure into Wonderland. It will soon be learned that none other than the Red Queen has put Wonderland into a state of decline. Alice is then given the task to try and stop her. Throughout the game, Alice will go through parts of Wonderland that have now seemingly become very dilapidated since her previous visit. Eventually, Alice will succeed in her quest to restore Wonderland back to its former glory, but not without some casualties along the way. In the final scene, a now functioning Alice will be seen back in London picking up her cat and walking through the gates of Rutledge Asylum and into the sunset to live happily ever after. Except that can't happen because a decade later a sequel called Alice Madness Returns would be released. The game picks up around a year later. Alice is now 19 years old and living in a London orphanage called Houndsditch Home for Wayward Youth. She's also currently being treated for a handful of conditions related to her mental health. One day after an appointment with her therapist, Dr. Bumby, Alice is sent to collect medication. Upon this journey, she begins to follow a cat, which leads her to a lady called Pris Witless. It's discovered that Witless is using Alice's confession to blackmail her in order to obtain money. You may be asking yourself, what exactly was Alice's confession? It turns out Pris Witless was a nurse at the Rutledge Asylum at the time of Alice's residency and would overhear Alice blaming herself for the fire that killed her family. Witless would assume the rantings of a very heavily mentally ill person to be a confession of her having a hand in said fire. Witless claimed that she had information on Alice's missing stuffed rabbit, which Alice deeply desired to have returned to her. Witless would take her to a rooftop, and shortly after interaction with Alice, Witless would begin to transform into the scary Jabberwock, which in my opinion was probably Alice suffering from a hallucination. And off Alice goes again on her next adventure into Wonderland. Throughout the game, Alice will again visit nightmarish environments throughout Wonderland, whilst also having portions of the story see her travel back to London, then back again to Wonderland, and vice versa. Alice will also begin to remember what really happened the night of the house fire that saw her family killed. Along the way, Alice will again meet characters she had previously met in the first game, including, yes, the Cheshire Cat. The Red Queen is no longer the main antagonist. This time it's a man named Angus Bumby, yes, Alice's very own therapist. It would be revealed that Bumby had snuck into Alice's childhood home late one night and killed Lizzie, Alice's older sister, and used the fire as a means to cover up his crime. By the end of the game, Alice would finally have the memories back of what really happened that night, and she'd also take revenge against the man who had stolen so much from her life, killing Bumby by pushing him in front of an oncoming train. She would then step out into a world that was a mix between reality and Wonderland, which American McGee would call Londonland. Now we come to Alice Otherlands. Otherlands contains 2 short films that act as a kind of sequel to Madness Returns. Otherlands takes place around a year after Madness Returns, with Alice now being 20 years old. I won't go too much into these. Basically, this mini-series, if you will, was designed to bring closure to Alice's story, although I didn't really get that feeling from watching them myself, but maybe you will. So now we're all caught up, kinda. I did skip a bunch of content from previous games, as I just kinda wanted to give a basic understanding of the story so far. I strongly suggest at least going back and playing Madness Returns to understand the story more fully, because it is a great game in my opinion. Janky at times, but wonderful. So Alice Asylum, what was it going to be? Asylum would have been the 3rd game in the series, and by indications the final installment in the series, as American McGee envisioned it as a trilogy. The game would have started with a 13-year-old Alice in a moonlit garden. This place would have been called the Slumber. The Slumber is described as a place containing Alice's childhood memories. Unfortunately, a nightmare haunts Alice. She looks up towards the moon. There's something odd she senses about it, and suddenly the moon reveals a menacing face. It locks eyes onto Alice as it howls and begins to give chase. In the pursuit, Alice finds herself tripping and falling to the snow-covered ground. Rising to her feet, this time with determination etched into her face, Alice once again runs, finding sanctuary finally inside her childhood home, the Liddell house. Silence fills the room, except for the tick-tock of a large grandfather clock. As Alice explores the house, she encounters the twisted, burnt manifestations of what appear to be her father, mother, and sister. They sit at the family table, waiting for Alice to join them. It's Alice's birthday. The members of the family all wearing white rabbit masks. Black cake is on the table. The cake is a writhing mass of black tentacles. On top of the cake are burning miniature figures of humans, each symbolizing a member of the family. As the candles begin to melt, so do the figures that sit around the table, blood and flesh dripping from their faces and onto the floor. Music echoes with hints of happy birthday. As her family continued to melt, they feast on the cake, shoveling it into their mouth holes. Alice now finds herself alone in the room with the exception of a mirror. Alice looks into the mirror, seeing her reflection and noticing a terrifying shadow, shapeless and jagged. It looks back at her. Alice extends her hand towards the mirror, trying to touch the creature. It suddenly breaks through the glass. As the glass shatters, Alice tries to defend herself, suffering hundreds of cuts in the process. A large shard of glass is about to pierce her heart. Alice grabs it and it transforms into a crystal version of the Vorpal blade. She is fixated on the blade that now drips with her own blood and running a finger along the sharp edge. Her focus on the blade is now broken as she is surrounded by ghoulish, faceless manifestations of shadow. That is more or less how the opening of the game would have begun. Not long after this, Alice would find herself tumbling back into a world she was very familiar with, Wonderland. To me, this sounds like a great introduction to the 3rd part of the series. Unfortunately, this is something we will possibly never get to see. Why? Because EA, the company that owns the IP for the American McGee series of the Alice games, decided that the game would not be made. Why did EA decide this? I asked myself, so I decided to look into it. In January 2023, American McGee reached out to his contacts at EA, attempting to pitch the idea of Asylum. McGee would send them an email, making small talk and sending previews of the game Bible. The game Bible was basically a large document detailing elements of the game, from the gameplay mechanics, what the animations might look like, character designs, the unlockables, possible DLC such as what dresses Alice might be able to get, story elements, and much more. In this email, McGee made it clear he was hoping to get the ball rolling on possible funding for the game. In the Patreon where McGee shared this email, he revealed he was hoping to get funding in the amount of around $42 million. McGee alerted to the fact that 2023 was the do or die year for Alice Asylum. In other words, if it was not going to happen then, it likely never will. McGee also stated that the amount estimated may be too much, but said that the next 12 months will reveal the fate of Asylum, and that as of the date of the post, it was day 1. On April 7th, 2023, a new post made on the Patreon titled End of the Adventure would appear. In this post, McGee thanked everyone for their support, then going on to confirm that after the Bible had been finished, he had also resumed talks with EA regarding it moving forward was going to be an option. He passed over the finished design Bible to his contacts at EA, and within the next several weeks, McGee would receive his answer on if funding or licensing would be a possibility. McGee stated that EA had passed on funding the project, the reason for the decision being based on an internal review of the IP, market conditions, and details of the production proposal. EA had also passed on allowing licensing, EA stating that Alice is an important part of EA's overall game catalogue and that they're just not prepared to do it right now. So McGee then says Alice Asylum is at an end. He also goes on to say that he has exhausted all ideas to get a new Alice game made, also that he is done with game production in general. He also makes it clear that even if Asylum is one day greenlit, he does not wish to be involved with its production. He closes, hoping that the post will bring closure to those that followed along the journey. The final couple of posts on Patreon both included an FAQ to answer some questions that understandably many may have had. A couple of those questions include the following: why didn't McGee just buy the Alice license from EA? The answer given states that you can't force someone to sell you something they don't want to, which of course is obvious. As for something such as renting the IP, which I've seen some people suggest as an idea, the answer dives into this as well. The answer is quite simple. EA has allegedly refused these types of offers. EA had also seemingly shut down communications with McGee, as one of the later questions asks, will they be making a hard copy of the Asylum Bible? To which it clearly is stated in the answer given that people who control the Alice stuff will no longer reply to their emails. In the final post, McGee states that he and his team tried as hard as they could, not just as developers, but also as fans to get this project going. However, he also makes it clear that EA are the reason it is dead. Literally writing, EA decided to kill the project and the possibility of any future for Alice. He also goes on to urge fans to move forward with him and let go of Alice.
And this is why at the end of the Asylum work, I asked everybody to please just move on.
McGee has also gone on record requesting to be left alone when it comes to subjects based on Alice, further making it clear that he has decided to move on from the series. So where does this leave the future of Alice Asylum? Unfortunately, nowhere. McGee himself stated in the post that EA decided to squash any hope that Alice Asylum may be made. They're not even willing to allow him to work on it in any way, shape or form, based on the statements made. Again, in McGee's own words,
Electronic Arts made clear that they have no desire to see the Alice franchise continued by me or anyone else.
Madness Returns was not a major success back when it released. Sales weren't amazing and initial reviews were not very favourable. This could have very likely played into EA's decision not to go through with Asylum. However, that's not to say Madness Returns was a complete failure either. It has also continued to keep selling over the years since its release in 2011. At the time of making this video, I can't find a clear answer to the initial sales numbers for Madness Returns, but it was purported to be made on a budget of around $9 million. I have my own theory as to why EA may not even be willing to rent the IP to McGee. American's McGee Alice is relatively dark in nature. I did not go over some of the darker aspects of the story in my brief summaries, including what fully happened to Alice's sister Lizzie. Madness Returns was released in 2011. The world is a very different place now and companies are much more careful about sensitive subjects due to the possibility of backlash that may lead to them being cancelled. American McGee's version of Alice was a dark take on a classic character. Asylum would have likely been just as dark as the previous entries, or even more dark in nature, and from what I read in the Bible, it was probably leaning to being more dark than the previous entries. I feel EA wouldn't have been willing to take the risk. Again, this is just my theory, and I have nothing to base it on. So, will there ever be a third game in the series? At the moment, it's looking highly unlikely. However, times do change, and so it's not an impossibility. Again, American McGee has stated it'd want nothing to do with its production if there were to be one. McGee is somewhat known to overreact at times from stuff I've read from the industry.
One of my long-term coping mechanisms for stress is to run away, and that was exactly what I did in that instance. I went and found a place where I could be alone and I could think about everything that had happened. One of the thoughts that was very frequently with me was one of, I guess you'd call, shame at having invested so much of our community's energy and resources into trying to make this thing happen and having failed at achieving that goal.
However, again, times do change, and so it's not an impossibility to think that he may decide differently at a later time. So, there we have it. Unfortunately, for those of us that would have loved to see the series get a final chapter, EA just would not let the project go forward. No ifs or buts. They control the IP, and unfortunately, they have the power. And with that in mind, I'd like to end this video with a thank you for your time. I made this video because I recently played Madness Returns after having it in my Steam library for over a decade. I fell in love with it, the style, the atmosphere, the story, you name it. I just became obsessed with the world of this series. So again, thank you, and I'm going to close out with a message from American McGee.
If there are additional questions or thoughts or complaints or anything that you have in relation to Alice, you must direct those at EA.